Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast, Cybersecurity Standards Scorecard 2024 edition. Today's feature speaker is James Tarala. If during the webcast you have any questions for James, feel free to enter them into the Q&A window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording will be available for viewing in the next 48 hours, all of which can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to James.
Great, thank you. Welcome, everybody. My name is James Tarala. I'm one of the SANS instructors. I've had the privilege of being a courseware author and an instructor here at SANS for going on 25 years now. So I've been here just a little bit doing this work. And I'm honestly excited about today's presentation. This is a presentation in a series that we've been giving for, boy, I think this might be the fourth or fifth year in a row we've given this webcast in the fall. And really what it is it's the result of a lot of the research that we've been doing relating to cybersecurity standards. As many of you know, like I said, I've been here at the SANS Institute for quite a few years, and I've had the privilege to work and teach in a lot of the different classes, but where I spend most of my time is in the area of cybersecurity risk assessment. The classes that I teach are primarily in that space, and kind of what I've authored is in that space as well. And the research I've really been getting into here these last few years have been trying to understand better how cybersecurity standards work together. In 2008, I had the privilege of starting to work, which is on a project which is now managed by the Center for Homeland Security, the CIS controls, and worked on that project for about 12 or 13 years. And then for about the last 4 or 5 years, I've been working on some additional research that we'll talk a little bit more here today to see how that relates to standards. And it was interesting because I was having dinner with John Strand, who also was instructor with SANS for a long time, and we were at a conference, and John had just finished teaching class. I remember quite a few years back, and John said to me, he said, James, he said, there's a lot of these cybersecurity standards out there, and he said to me, he said, honestly, I just tell my clients, tell my students, just pick one, just move forward. It doesn't really matter which one you pick. They're all basically the same. And that conversation really sort of stuck with me, because the more I thought about it, the more I thought, I don't know that that's actually true. And so I started digging in, doing some research to see what that looks like. And really what you're seeing in this webcast series is the result of that conversation we had and some of the research that we've put in ever since that time. For the sake of distraction and you being able to see the slides, I'm not going to stay on camera the whole time here. I believe that we'll come back on maybe for some Q&A here in a little bit. We've got a lot we want to talk about, though. I'm really excited about some of the new research that came out this year, so I want to make sure we have plenty of time to share that. If we do have some time at the end, I'll try to cover questions. Please use the Q&A section, though. If you do have questions, we'll do our best to hit as many of those as we can. But please don't be offended if we don't get a chance to get to yours. Like I said, we have a lot we want to cover today. I want to make sure we have plenty of time to get through all the topics that we have here on our list. All right, so that being said, if we look at the state of the world today, and we want to understand what's out there as it relates to cybersecurity standards, there's literally dozens, if not low hundreds, of cybersecurity standards, regulations around the world that we could potentially address. And I've heard this statement over and over again from organizations that it really just doesn't matter which of these we pick, because they all basically do the same thing. And as long as you pick one, you're probably fine, and it probably addresses everything you need to address. But like I said earlier, I don't know that that could be any further from the truth. And I think when we start digging in and looking at the details, I think it's the details that probably matter the most in this conversation. And I think what we assume is because these standards are put out by reputable bodies, which again, they mostly are, that they're probably doing their due diligence. They're thinking about the issues we need to address, and everything we need to concern ourselves with is there in that standard. But it's been interesting as we start to compare these more and more, just how different they are. One of the things that we found in our initial studies years ago, and if you've been following the series, I've given this example a couple times. One of the things that shocked us in the early research we did was how few standards talked about some of the more important cyber hygiene defenses that are out there. The one that kind of caught our attention in the early days was patch management. As simple as that sounds, right? If we sort of did a poll in the room, right? Like how many of us think that patch management is something that we should be doing? I think it'd be probably pretty universal that we'd all agree, yeah, it's maybe hard to do and time consuming, but we all believe it's something we probably should do. But the reality is that so many of these standards don't actually call things like that out. And what they do is they make these assumptions that, we'll do good endpoint security, but they leave it up to us to figure out what that really means. And that makes kind of a loose definition for some of these safeguards. And what I've found over and over again is that organizations tend to pick which safeguard they're going to follow based on something other than the contents of that safeguard library, that standard that's there. Maybe it's popularity. Maybe it has to do with what other organizations in their industry are using. Maybe it has to do with something that their CIO used at their previous company. I have a company here recently where they were following one standard for 10, 12 years and presenting to leadership using that standard. And next thing you know, they hired a new board member, and the new member on the board had used the NIST cybersecurity framework at a previous organization where he was on the board. Next thing you know, now the organization's using that standard too. And there's a lot of these kinds of reasons, I think, a lot of times that lead organizations to decide what it is that they want to base their standards on. And the reality that we found was that there really wasn't a lot of conversation out there about any sort of methodology or evaluation criteria, how we can compare these. What does a good standard actually look like? What does that actually mean? And that's the kind of thing that I think we need to be able to have a conversation about when we start talking about some of these standards. It was interesting, even this month, I had a conversation with an agency. I won't say which one, just for the sake of privacy, but an agency saying, yeah, we need to make a new standard in this area for the people that are under our responsibility. And so we're going to put out an RFP, and whoever bids the best, we're just going to go ahead and put it to committee, tell that company to write a standard, and we'll publish one. But there's no really a conversation about, well, what goes into that, and why are we picking a consulting group to do that? Is that consulting group qualified to do this? Are they basing it on the principles that we need to be addressed? There's none of those conversations are really being had. And I guess we wanted to have a webcast series where we could talk about this a little bit and go through some of the standards and talk about pros and cons, what's changed this year, and talk about some of those high level issues. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk a little bit about creating methodologies for doing that kind of grading and that kind of assessment. Yes, as we go through this, I'm actually going to give letter grades to some of the more popular standards. Hopefully this year, it's a much more quantifiable process than we've ever done in the past. Actually, I'm really excited this year about what we're going to be talking about, just simply because honestly, there's a lot more rigor that we put into this year's, and it's a lot more automated and programmatic this year. So I'm really actually excited to share with you some of the updates that have taken place. So where I see us today is sort of, I saw this picture and it really sort of caught my attention of where sort of the state of the union is in 2024 as it relates to cybersecurity standards. I feel like we're all on this walk, we're all on this journey, and we're all trying to figure out, how do we actually achieve our mission? And each of our organizations exists for a reason, right? We all have a mission, a reason, a purpose for why we exist, and why people show up in the morning to actually do work for that organization. And we all know that cybersecurity is an enabler that enables technology to help the organization operationally. And again, cybersecurity teams end up being enablers of the technology teams, who are enablers who can helpfully enable the organization to achieve its objectives. And that's why this all exists. But as we're on this journey, I feel like we're not really sure where we're going as far as the strategy, the plan. And so we latch on to somebody who seems to know what they're talking about, and we seem to follow that approach, right? So we follow the person he seems confident, right? Seems to know what they're doing. And, so if a national agency says, hey, here's a standard, we're going to give it credit because, as we should, right? A national agency has put time into something and we should give it thought. Or if an industry group tells us they've put thought into something, we want to pay attention to what they have to say. But what often happens is we're just simply often wandering, and we're not exactly sure why we're doing some of these things. And so anyway, so what we see is I feel like a lot of organizations are maybe not necessarily lost, but we don't necessarily have a clear direction of what it is we're trying to achieve. The other thing that I would say too is the world has changed a bit in the last couple of years. If you'd have come to me, even let's say 3 or 4 years ago, there's a really good chance you might have been sort of team something, right? You'd have said, we really adhere to ISO in our organization. We follow 27002, or we really follow the NIST standards. And so that's something we're really sold on, or we're a CIS shop, or, whatever it is. And a lot of organizations would have that mindset. They say, well, we're just going to be tied in to this one particular standard. But the reality is that I don't know many organizations that just have one standard to adhere to. And so that's part of this conversation now too. A lot of the customers that I'm dealing with, frankly, have 5, 7, 12 different standards that they have to put together in order to solve the challenge that's in front of them. And so that's added an extra layer of complexity because we're not just trying to adhere to one issue. There might be multiple things that we're trying to address. So that'll becomes part of the challenge that we're trying to address through this process. So again, we said before, but this webcast has been an annual webcast. It's something we've done for, I think this is, like I said, the 4th or 5th year we've done this study. And the hope is a couple of things we want to make sure we do. One is we want to have a relatively objective or rigorous standard that we can use to evaluate the standards that are out there. So we can look at some of the popular standards, the things that you hear about in the news, the things that hopefully your boss are talking to you about, those kinds of things. And every year we've been in the process of reevaluating the evaluation criteria that we use to look at these standards. And we tweak that process just a little bit. In fact, you're going to see here in just a minute, we have a formula that we even use now to look at that criteria and use it to quantify the results and basically come up with a score. And then that score turns into a letter grade. And we've actually made this a programmatic approach this year, which is something new. And then I'll demo some things for you to see how we actually do this. The goal also of this is not just to give the evaluation. I mean, certainly I think, we can give some objective information. We're going to show you all the information that fed into this. So we're not going to hide any data. We're just going to show it to you and let you make your own conclusions. That way you can make decisions from this. And maybe you decide you want to tweak the criteria. You say, you know what, James, would be amazing is what if we added this information or we prioritized this part of the conversation? And in fact, I would say, if you look at some of the things that we're going to look at here and you say, I really think you should consider prioritizing this aspect more, say so and tell me about it. And what I'm excited for is now that we have this programmatic approach in place, what we can do is we're just simply tweaking the formula and tweaking the algorithm every year. And it becomes a much, I'll say a much more rich conversation, I feel like, because we have such a foundation laid over these past few years of work. At the end of the day, though, what I'm hoping to do, really what it comes down to, I guess, if I could focus it though, is I want to give you objective information that you can take back to your offices and you can use it to make better decisions. Everyone will laugh, and I know there's even drinking games in my class about how many times I refer to certain authors and things like that. But if I summarize a quote from Douglas Hubbard and some of the work he does on cybersecurity risk management, he talks about the reason we measure things, whether it's cyber or other parts of business, is because we want to measure those things so that we can make better decisions. Or said another way, we want to be able to reduce uncertainty to make better decisions. And so that's what I'm hopefully going to be able to do with you guys today, is I'm going to show you some of the things that are there, the characteristics that are in place in some of these standards, and then go ahead and take a look at those and see what we would do with that to bring back to our organizations, hopefully to make better decisions about what our target state might be. So for this year, we in depth have evaluated about 70 different standards. Now, there's more on my plate. And the cool thing is, I'll talk a little bit about my architecture here in just a minute. But the way the new architecture works for doing our evaluation is we can put each standard through a standardized or a normalized formatting process. As many of you know, most of these standards come out in websites or PDF files or something like that. But once we normalize the data from those, whatever format it comes out in, we're able to take that data, tag that data, upload it into our databases, and automatically add it to the scoring tool that I'm going to show you here in just a minute. So like I said, we're about 70 different standards we've evaluated that we have these scorecards on today. And we've got another, I think it's maybe 20 or 30 sort of on the plate that we're going to look at maybe between now and the end of the year. So we're going to keep adding them. But obviously there's some big ones that are kind of front and center to a lot of us. And we want to make sure that we prioritize those. And I didn't want this to be literally 70 to 100 slides of just graphs and charts. Certainly I can provide access to some of that to you. But more importantly, what I want you to be able to see is how some of these new standards relate. So some of the new things that came out in 2024 that we wanted to make sure was on top of mind. Certainly things like the CIS Controls 8.1 that came out this year. Certainly the NIST CSF version 2, that's one that's gotten a lot of attention. For those of you who haven't seen it, I did a detailed webcast on that earlier this year as well. CMMC, looking at that, I mean, that's been around for a couple years here, but still a big part of the conversation. Rev 3 to 80171 was released. There's some things there. Again, not a huge update, but still worth considering. Again, it's been a couple years here from 27002's update, but that's kind of on our list here. PCI, HIPAA. I know one people have asked me on the side about NYDFS, the Amendment 2 that came out end of last year, something worth talking about as well. CRF safeguards and others, right? So a lot of these kinds of standards are kind of went into the evaluation. So any of these you see here were definitely on the list. Like I said, plus quite a few more that weren't here. One of the things that we realized when going into this year is that we wanted to make some changes to the mindset. And like I said, this is an annual study, and so you can definitely go back and look at previous years. I don't want this year's presentation to be a recap of every year up to this point, but there are some changes that we did go ahead and think about. One of the big things that we've been doing is understanding that these cybersecurity standards that we talk about need to be evaluated by category. And what we're finding is different standards get created for different reasons. And in other words, like if you look at a cyber hygiene standard, like something from the Australian government, like the ACSC, for example, their Essential 8, that was created for a very specific reason. They wanted to give a list of hygiene controls that's sort of a bare minimums. You really need to do at least these things if you do nothing else, right? That kind of idea. There's other standards that are in that camp, things like the NSA's top 10s or some of their research from GCHQ or some of those kinds of standards that come out. And so those, we can evaluate them using the same methodology, but as you can imagine, they score really bad because frankly, they only cover a few of the top safeguards that really they want you to focus on. So we realized one of the things we needed to do was categorize these. And so one of the things that we've tried to focus on, and you'll see in this presentation, is I'm going to be addressing what I'll call in air quotes, more comprehensive standards. Or if a standard is sort of billing themselves as do these things and you'll be safe, then you end up on, you get a full grade, in my opinion, right? Because once you've told everybody that if you're sort of the definitive standard and if we do your things, then we should be safe, then I think you're fair game to be on that list. So like I said, a hygiene model that comes out from an intelligence agency, something that's going to be different than, say, a tool that's going to be risk-centric or governance-centric, something like that. So again, we focus primarily on comprehensive standards, although we have graded all the standards that are in our database. So, but just be prepared for that. Like if you look at a hygiene standard, that's probably the best example I can give. If a hygiene standard scores poorly on this model, it's because we're evaluating so many things against it. And it was never that body's intention to necessarily do the things that we're asking it to do. So it's almost unfair of us to be asking these hygiene standards to really be comprehensive standards. I don't want to take them out of the database because I think we lose some interesting data if we do that. But at the same time, I think as we're trying to do categorizations, we need to keep that in mind as we're having that conversations. The other thing that we realized going into this year was that it almost feels like there's a little bit of a popularity contest going on, and different standards are popular year by year. And the best analogy that I can give is it almost feels like a stock, right? You've got stocks that are popular or that are on the rise. You have stocks that are maybe falling and not as popular this year for whatever reason. And it almost kind of feels that way with some of these standards. And so more and more what I'm finding, I mean, I'll just give a quick example. If we look at the NIST cybersecurity framework, it almost feels like they became more popular in 2024 simply because they did an update. Now, was that a substantial update? Well, we'll get into that here in just a second. I don't know how substantial it really was, but because they put it in front of us again and gave it a new rev number, it almost feels like it got in the news cycle again. And so I just want us to be a little careful of those kinds of things. I don't know that recency of an update necessarily always equates to quality of an update. And nothing against the folks at the CSF. I think they've got a lot of good resources there. But I just want to kind of warn you that that does happen sometimes. So as we're going through these, like I said, there's going to be categories of standards that we have to address. I mentioned the two top categories right away, right? We talked about cyber hygiene standards. Things like, for example, we talked about the Australian Essential 8, the ACSC Essential 8. If you haven't seen that standard, by the way, even though it doesn't score well in our model, it's a very good standard and something that I would definitely encourage you to check out. In fact, I didn't even want to put a slide on them just simply because I don't want it to appear in any way that it's a negative there. So again, our criteria list is pretty big. We have a lot of, we're asking for folks. So I don't know that really scoring the hygiene standard is really fair to any of them. But you can see that there's a lot that are out there. And if you're looking for those hygiene standards, again, my favorite, it's just knowing the data behind that project is probably one of the most data-rich projects that's out there when it comes to cybersecurity standards. But again, you've got those hygiene standards, which would be one example of those. In addition to that, we also have what I'll consider then those comprehensive standards. These are the ones where you see an organization saying, if you do these things, we feel like you've laid a pretty strong foundation for most of what you need to do to be able to defend yourself. Now, are any of these standards saying we truly are comprehensive or we're truly doing everything? I don't know about that. One of the ones you'll see auspiciously missing from our list here is NIST 853. Again, something that would score really well against our models, but the problem is it kind of breaks some things in the process too. So we had to be a little careful about including those in some of our databases. But again, you can see some of the standards that would be included in that model that's there, right? 800-171, CIS controls, PCI, etc. There's also others, which I might call more cybersecurity buffet standards. Some people will call these issue-specific standards. And again, you'll see where basically you see some sort of regulatory body or industry body saying, we see a problem in the cybersecurity space that we're not doing this thing, and we really want to push the mindset behind this thing. Let's get you to do it. So if you look at something like NYDFS and the 500 standard, for example, a lot of you will know that multi-factor authentication is something that they sort of call out that way. The CSA CCM, the cloud-specific standard, right? It has some very specific safeguards that are related to cloud that might be a little more targeted there. FCA's examination manual, the IRS's publication 1075, right? There's all a little bit of that mindset behind all these. And then, of course, we've got the governance standards as well. COBIT, the AICPA standard that's used as part of SOC 2 Type 2, is probably many of you are aware of that standard. We could even argue like a COSO or an Octave Forte or some of those might fit into here. For the most part, I've left a lot of those out, things like Octave Forte or FAIR or some of those, because the scope of those models really isn't to define safeguards. It's really more to be able to say, this is how you could consider doing risk management, but that doesn't actually define the safeguards themselves. And so really that's almost a different classification of itself and falls out of the scope of the analysis we're trying to do. They still are on our radar and we still know they exist, or like the Carnegie Mellon resilience model, for example, great model when it comes to BCP and DR and incidents and such. But again, the scope of that is so different that we're cautious about including that into our database. We would want to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples in a lot of this work that we're doing. So in 2024, what we did was we came up with a new set of criteria. This is based on a lot of the criteria, or similar criteria was used in the past, but we did do some updates just to hopefully refresh it a little bit and give ourselves a fresh start and a fresh view on some of this. And what we did was, for today's presentation at least, what we're going to focus on is actually looking at the individual standards themselves. And we're going to look at the comprehensive standards that we think are probably ones that a lot of you are considering building your programs around. And so that's the part of the conversation, really, I guess, that I wanted to make sure that we were bringing awareness to, because if you're going to build your program around, say, the NIST CSF, or you're going to build it around ISO 27002 or CIS controls or whatever it is, I want you to understand how they relate to each other, because again, they are different and they are trying to achieve a similar goal, but the way that they go about doing it is very, very different. I remember once when I was working with Center for Security, and Tony Sager and I were talking a little bit about this issue. One of the versions of the CIS controls, I don't remember which one. We were evaluating feedback that was coming in, and we were getting a lot of emails from people and a lot of different. Eventually they started using a tool called the Workbench tool to start taking in feedback and such. And it's really interesting that a lot of people got super specific about their recommendations. And we were really trying to debate, how do we show respect to the people that are bringing in these recommendations, but also try to stay clear to our mission of giving people a prioritized set of defenses. And Tony's response was, he said, listen, he said, people are always going to bring pet rocks to these conversations. Everybody has their own set of safeguards that they love. That's their pet rock. And they're going to push that thing. And we have to be careful to make sure that if that pet rock is appropriate, if it does really help organizations to achieve an objective, then we need to include it. But if it really is just somebody's favorite project and the thing that they do their research on, so it's the most important thing in the world to them, we have to sometimes be willing to say, no, that doesn't actually belong in this kind of a standard. And the one thing I'll say, probably a lot of you have heard this before from me or from other people, is the people who do this kind of work do tend to write safeguards around the topics that they're most comfortable with, the things that they're most familiar with. So if you think about it, if you have somebody who's writing a standard and they feel very comfortable writing standards, and they're really good at governance safeguards, for instance, well, then they're going to include a lot of governance-oriented safeguards. I mean, use the AICPA, right, or the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. Not to say that CPAs can't be technical, but certainly, AICPA has a bit of a more governance bent to them and less of a technical bent. They're not going to talk about platform as a service configurations. They're going to be more concerned about how the organization holistically addresses safeguards. That's just the viewpoint that they come from. But then what that means is when you read that AICPA standard, if you're looking at like at a SOC 2 Type 2 or something, you just need to know that that SOC 2 Type 2 is going to be a little more governance heavy than technical heavy. And that's how these standards work. So anyway, what we wanted to do is be able to look at criteria for each of these then that gave a balanced perspective. It doesn't mean that we expect everybody to get A pluses. In fact, literally nobody got an A this year, which is fine. I'm actually okay with people not getting A's. But where I want to show is just simply the pros and cons that each of these different safeguards offers. So that when you're making a decision, you see what's good and what could be improved potentially in some of these. And so I won't read all these to you. You'll see the first set there. A lot of what you see on the left, for example, are going to be categories of safeguards. And so what we did was we summarized, and what we did is we said, all right, we're going to look at these categories of safeguards, create some numeric representations of how much coverage they actually give, and then we'll go ahead and rate each of those individually. I'll show you an example of this here in just a second. We also looked, were the safeguards updated recently? Again, there is sort of a recency bias, I understand, but at the same time, what I'm finding is there are some standards in our list we evaluated that haven't been updated in 7 or 8 years. And I think that's something that we have to reflect. So if it's been a little while since it's been updated, then we probably need to have a conversation about that. We asked, is this a community-driven development cycle? In other words, does the community get to provide feedback, ask for edits? Is this a group of consultants that got paid a fee, and the next thing you know, they walked away from the standard, we never hear from them again? I mean, where does this come from, right? So who drives development? We did put popularity in because why not, right? It's a conversation point. If everybody's doing a particular set of safeguards, maybe it's easier for our organization to adopt it as well, adopt a common language. We talked about, are threats mapped to these controls or the safeguards that are defined, or is it just a library of safeguards? Turns out just most of the safeguard libraries, in fact, really all but one really doesn't do this. There's really only one standard, and that would be what MITRE is releasing in their Defend, where they've actually done some of that mapping. We want to talk about modern threats, so things that are actually facing you today, not just theoretical things, but the threats we actually see and practice right now. We want to know if these safeguards are mapped to other standards, or is it just one isolated document? Are they tagged for applicability? So in other words, where these apply, is it just to organizations' infrastructure? Does it work against their third parties? Does it work in OT, right? Does it work in cloud, IoT, right? There's lots of different scopes here potentially we could address. In addition to that as well, one of the big ones for me is actually, are these safeguards prioritized? Most of these libraries are in the range of 50 to about maybe 150 safeguards per document. Of course, it varies a little bit. You get people on the edges, but that 50 to 150 is about the average. Actually, about 100 plus, 100, 110 is probably about the median there. But as you look at that, are those safeguards prioritized, or are you just being asked to do all of those 100 things all at once? And I think the idea of having guidance to be able to say, where do you start that journey, can be really useful. So that was something that was important to me to make sure that we asked about. And then, is there a corresponding measurement guide? In other words, so if we tell you, here's the good things you should be doing, are you also giving the people reading your documentation a way to measure that? Now, like we talked about earlier, the importance of measurements that are there. A great example of that would be looking at something like 800-171 from NIST, and the corresponding 800-171A, which of course is their assessment guide. So looking for that kind of documentation to help support the process. The baseline that we used for this is something that we've formalized a bit this year as well, over at the Cybersecurity Risk Foundation. Many of you know that I've been involved in projects putting up resource pages like auditscripts.com and other things like that over the years. And this year what we did was we really wanted to work to consolidate and formalize a lot of the research that was there. We actually formed a legal entity to house this research. We've got a board that's helping us sort of set direction and things. Because we wanted to make sure that we were giving resources the right way. So we created the Cybersecurity Risk Foundation over at crfsecure.org. And what you see is that they've created a lot of resources there that we can use as a part of our research and what we're doing. So one of the things that we did sort of collaborate on there was the ability to create an aggregate library of safeguards. And so the way that we used measurement against the baseline was we said we took those 70 plus standards that I mentioned earlier, and we basically said, what would organizations need to do to be compliant with all of the safeguards from all of these 70 different standards? And then what we did was we normalized that data into one list. And our thought was, we don't want to bring too many new ideas to the table. And our first round at this, or go around at this, we basically said, we're going to just make sure that we're reflecting what the industry says. So we're not trying to bring our opinions into it. We're just trying to say, here are the things that the industry has already decided that we should do. And then we measured everyone against that aggregate set of knowledge. Now, in the last year or so, we've also added some extra detail. Like, for example, one of the areas that wasn't really addressed by anyone was mobility. And so we wanted to add some safeguards in that space just to help give people guidance in that area. So we have added some of these topics in there that we felt were pretty big gaps. And we're probably going to add a few more of those as time goes on. But for the most part, you'll see most of the baseline that we used for this was that aggregate set of safeguards that we came from a bunch of these different groups. So like I said, at this point, we're a little over 70 standards. We're like 3,500, going on almost 4,000 control statements, summarized to a little over 400 statements. And then that became the baseline that we used to measure all of these other safeguard libraries against, at least when it came to completeness of the safeguards. Right, so there's other categories where obviously other criteria that we use that aren't really related to that, but we had to create a baseline to use to measure things against. And this is what we went ahead and used for that purpose. And that was sort of, like I said, originally we had done this in Excel, and a lot of you have probably seen some of the work that I've put out over the years over to audit scripts or different places. And really, when we got to about 30 mappings, really we had pushed Excel way too far. And so we realized we needed to make some changes there. So this year, what we actually did, and this is one of the bigger changes we've made, is we actually moved all those Excel resources over to serverless architecture over to AWS. And using DynamoDB and the API gateway and Cognito and everything over there, we basically gave more of a database-centric approach to this, which has really made this much more scalable. Before this, it wasn't. I mean, we were definitely sort of capped out around the 30, 35 standard line that was there. Now I see no problem getting into the hundreds of standards if we need to, just the way that the database is architected. I think it's going to be really quite scalable for the future. And I'll show you some examples of this. But we created an API to help facilitate the research and facilitate the reporting. And in fact, one of the biggest things I'd say in this year that we did that I'm probably most excited about and kind of the work that we did is that everything in these coming slides are completely automated now. It used to be that we would have to manually go through and do much of this this work and create manual graphs and different things, but all of that here in 2024 has been automated now and is driven by this backend data, the data source that we have, making it much more quantifiable and much more objective. For that, we tried to be objective. We tried not to let opinions make our way in previous studies, but I feel like this year we've done a much better job. And again, the formula is pretty strict now. And the cool thing that I'm excited about is for future years too, is we have a group of people that are willing to look at that formula, debate the formula, talk the data science of it, and really make sure that that data is going to be objective into the future. So that's a part of it probably I'm most excited about for 2024. I feel like this is kind of a big pivot year for us as far as making this a more repeatable process and frankly, much more scalable as new standards come in. All right, so we'll get there here momentarily, and I'll show you that system. But one of the big ones that I think we all want to be aware of here. So again, if I just get practical here for you for a minute. One of the big changes, of course, that happened here, if I could talk about maybe the couple big ones that were out. One of the biggest changes that, of course, came out was the NIST version 2. As you can see, of course, that the functions, like the wheel, right, has changed as of this year. And you definitely see of all of the changes of all the different standards here that have kind of come out in 2024 so far, this is one that has probably gotten the biggest facelift. And as a result, what's happened is I think there's been much more popularity around this particular library than any of the others that are out there, simply because, again, it got a pretty big facelift. And RSA this year, they announced it, and you can kind of see the different parts of the wheel that are there, the govern aspect that's included in it. So that kind of became a big deal. Now, with that being said, how many changes actually took place? Well, I'm one of those weirdos that actually goes through and takes the standard and turns it into a text file and uses diff software to compare to see exactly what's changed. And it turns out between version 1 and version 1.1, the older versions, there was almost no changes. Conceptually, there's a couple statements on authentication, a couple statements on supply chain management, but for the most part, it was really grammar, typos, commas, and that was really the change between 1 and 1.1. Between 1.1 and 2, of course, what happened this year, you do still see a lot of grammatical changes, which is fine. And actually, to be fair and to credit to NIST, I think they used language which was much more digestible. And it was words that we all use to describe the safeguards that they were describing. It wasn't theoretical or philosophical. I felt like they made it more practical. So I like what they did on the grammar and just the syntactical side of things. They also, again, rewrote some of the safeguard language to be more practical, more relevant, more specific. Again, I liked all of that. And they used the new govern category that was there. And they even did a little bit of clarifying safeguards in each category as well. So a little bit more clarification and practicality, like I said. But all said and done, did they really change much between version 1 and version 2 or 1.1 and 2? Not really. Mostly it was a reorganization. You still see some supply chain third-party changes that are there. One could argue that there's a statement in there that looks like it's kind of application control, allow list like that's in there. So a couple little changes like that do show up. But for the most part, it's a reorganization, clarification, what I'll call sort of a cleanup fix. I'd almost rather than call this a 1.2, not to get picky, but I felt like this is more of a 1.2 than a 2.0, but it is what it is. So this is obviously a big change that came out. Well, one of the things then that we did, and this is where sort of gets into the meat of the research, is we went through then, and I know the wording is small. We'll make some of this available after the fact so you can zoom in and stuff if the slides are smaller, but there's a lot of data we have to try to present here. So what we did was we took each of the safeguards in the CSF, in the new 2.0 version, and what we basically did was mapped it against that aggregate library that I had talked about earlier. And so this is done at a really detailed level behind the scenes in the database. Then what we're able to do is we're able to do analytics, basically comparing each of the topics or domains that's covered in the aggregate library, and then measure each of the topics that are there in each of our standards against that core or that aggregate library. And so again, this is all programmatically generated now. So you see each of those topics on the left, program management, education, safeguard implementation, et cetera. Those are all going to, in fact, if you look at the top is going to be sort of more governance oriented. And then the bottom, you're going to see more of the technical controls, data management, access management, log management, et cetera. And it's interesting, that really big bar in the middle, third-party management, I mean, that's third-party risk management, something they've really been focused on. And you see that reflected. So I can tell you subjectively that it feels like third-party risk management's been a big focus of the CSF. But I mean, it's just, you can see it there in black and white. The data definitely sort of presents that way. And so, is it more system oriented or configuration management or mobile oriented, or is it third party oriented? Well, again, if you kind of look at the top half being a little more governance and the bottom half being a little more technical, definitely sort of feels like it's leaning towards that governance side. It's definitely sort of a broad conversation, but it's a little bit weighted on that governance side if you look at the graphs and the data that's there. We also went through and looked at individual categories as well. The first percent numbers, so let's see, the 7 different numbers that are there, the percents, those are reflective of how much coverage you saw on the previous graph. So of the governance safeguards, when we compared the CSF against the aggregate library, the CSF covered about 20% of the governance controls. When it came to system computing protections, they covered about 10%. When it came to network defenses, they covered 13%. When it came to cloud, they covered 4%. So it is what it is. And so that's kind of what we saw on a coverage map standpoint. So there's obviously a lot missing. Certainly there's a prioritization just by the fact that they've included or not included safeguards, but that's the reality, right? That there's a certain amount that's there and a certain amount that's also missing. But, they get a green for being updated here recently. Very popular, right? They get some points for that. They get some partial credit for addressing modern threats. In some cases they do, in other cases they don't, right? But so you see this overall sort of scorecard view in place. And we do this for a bunch of different standards. And what I'm going to do here for just a minute, we're going to tempt the demo gods here for just a minute here, and we'll see if I can actually do the demo with you here. Let's see. All right, fingers crossed, you can go ahead and see my screen there. All right, and so if I look at my tooling sort of behind the scenes, so what we did was we built a scorecard app, basically, where what we did was we said, all right, we want you to be able to select a safeguard from one of these different standards in our list. And so again, if I just go to the NIST 2.0, just to kind of look at the data that's in place and such, you can see that data is automatically generated now. And so what we wanted to be able to do is make this much easier for ourselves going forward, so we're not manually creating these, but every time we change the aggregate library, we can automatically update the graphs. And now every time we go through the process of adding a new standard, it'll automatically update itself here in our database. So all these things that you're seeing on my screens, for example, it's coming from what we see here, or again, you're seeing some of these individual scores that are down here below. That's where this comes from. And there's APIs behind the scenes that feed this, that feed these percents. These are calculations that come through based on the mappings that we've made. And then these are going to be based on a second API that we have in place that allows us to show that information. So I can show another standard here, for example, like here's NYCR 500 from NYDFS. Again, it's just slightly different, right? You'll see different safeguards in place, but look how it focuses on asset management, for example, or access management, or identity, right? Those sorts of things. But at the same time, it's not going to talk about email or cloud. It's not really on their agenda. But the point being is now what we can do is the cool thing about the criteria going forward is we can spend more time focusing on the appropriateness of the evaluation criteria and less on actually going through and doing these mappings just because of the way the database is structured. So again, we're going to go through and do these tests. So there's one more here just because we haven't seen one. Oh, here, find a good one maybe we haven't looked at yet. Here's HIPAA. Here's just an example of HIPAA that's from 2013. So those of you in healthcare, of course, obviously something that's been around a million years, but you can see the coverage that's in place there. And certainly they didn't score quite as well as you can imagine. For example, they're not covering any network controls, right? They're not specifically calling any of those out. Cloud controls, software development standards, right? So this gives us an ability to look objectively as we start to think about some of these standards. What I'll do is, I know we weren't going to have so much time today, and I'd love to go through all 70 plus of these with you, but I know we don't have time to actually do that. But I want you to at least be able to see for a second where that comes from. I had the privilege of actually working with my son on that, Trent Tarala, and then Ryan McBride, another one of the developers on our team, was really instrumental in making that happen over the last couple of months. So really excited and appreciate their help making that all happen for sure. All right, let me go ahead and share though. Again, we'll go back to this. Obviously, another one of the standards that came out this year that's gotten a little bit of attention, probably not as much as the CSF, but you can see here as well, just the idea of the CIS controls as well. They have their 8.1 standard that came out. So you can see that represented there on the slide. They've done a really good job. In fact, I'll show you just quick letter grades here in just a couple minutes, but you'll see here in just a moment that they actually scored really well comparatively against some of their standards. And you can see even the coverage map, even though it's interesting, their scope traditionally has not been to cover governance controls. There are certain areas where they did cover quite a bit on the governance side. So you can see some of their scores actually were quite well there. Again, there's kind of some history there where traditionally they don't address governance, but in recent versions, they've added a lot more governance statements in for what that's worth. And you can see that reflected there in the graph. Again, you can see some of their scores here as well. And again, you can see this data all later if you want to get into more detail on this. But again, you can see some of the things that they've done here are going quite well, right? Some of the green, yellow, reds obviously make a little bit of a difference. ISO, again, you can see, I'll just go through some of these a little bit faster just so we can kind of see what's here. But you can see again, the ISO, the 27002 standard, obviously one of the newer standards. It turns out where they're a little bit better is they're a bit better on the software development side than maybe some of the others. I would say CIS controls and ISO probably address more in terms of software development practices than probably most any of these other standards that are out there. So just kind of interesting note to be able to see that. Again, it's been a year or two since the standard's been released, but you see obviously a little balanced here, maybe a little heavier on the governance side, but especially seeing software development practices in place. So again, if you're looking pros and cons, if you're looking for a standard to help address software development, this might be, this and the CIS controls might be a couple you look at there. And again, you can see some of those other scores that lead to our overall score. The other one, of course, is getting a lot of attention this year is 800-171. I thought about maybe doing a combination of 800-171 and 800-172, but 172 is honestly so short, like what is it, 35 statements, I think it is. It would have scored poorly on its own, which I didn't think was fair to sort of show that. So I figured I would focus on 171, which, of course, as many of you know, is the foundation of the CMMC requirements that the U.S. Department of Defense has been putting out here over the last couple of years. Again, you'll see them also are a little bit of a balanced response. But you'll see, if anything, this is probably leaning against looking at some of the governance statements. This is a much more technical standard. So if you're looking at some of the standards that are out there, one of the things that I've been trying to point out to people is that if I were actually looking at just a purely technical standard, based on the data we're seeing, and you can see that here in this graph as well, is that the specific physical safeguards and technical safeguards that 800-171 calls out are probably some of the more specific safeguards that are out there from a technical standpoint. Now, the problem is when you skew one way or another, your aggregate score in our model sort of, gets a little bit off, right? So you might not score as well overall. But if your scope is simply to say, we want to make sure you have good technical defenses in place, then frankly, I'm always kind of surprised that 800-171 doesn't get more attention by people in the private sector. Now, there are scopes you can see that are completely missing, right? That aren't talked about at all. Program management, looking at internal network segmentation, things like zero trust kind of concepts, cloud practices, email security, very minimal statements on software development practices. So again, it's all about scoping when it comes to a lot of these standards. But again, you can see where a lot of that coverage exists and some of our scores there as it relates to the standard as a whole. We did go ahead and put CMMC level 3 as one of our graphs. And I'll just jump back just a second just so you can see it. So you can see there's coverage here from 800-171. And then what we did was we took some different standards there and added some of the 172 statements. And you can see there's a little bit different coverage as it relates to that as well. And then just to show you one of the hygiene standards, again, I wanted to make sure that we could at least talk about this. I don't want in any way for people to think that there's a problem with the standard or anything along those lines. But I wanted you to kind of see what I was talking about on the hygiene side. So if you look at some of the standards that are hygiene centric, and remember I've mentioned this a couple times now, the ACSC's Essential 8 is really a hygiene standard. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to say, we're going to focus just on safeguards that we think are most critical, sort of the due care, the most foundational for you to put in place, the things that we think will make the greatest impact on your organization. And so, when you look at some of the things that they cover here, obviously they're not trying to get a broad definition. They want to be able to have you focus on the things that actually make a difference. And again, I mentioned earlier, if you're looking for just a good quantitative study on safeguard selection, I would really look into the background of this project. It's actually probably one of my favorites. What they did was they looked at the Australian government and the systems that the Australian government maintains, and they looked at incidents and attacks that were taking place against their systems. And they went through and did root cause analysis on all of those different cases and basically came back and said, these are the things we could have done in advance to have stopped those attacks before they actually took place. And the history there, of course, is ACSC, which is the Australian version of the NSA, so it's some intelligence there that does a lot of cyber work for the Australian government. That information was then presented to Australian Parliament, and Parliament actually passed some laws saying, okay, well, if you're a government agency, this is pretty good information to have. Make sure you're putting these safeguards in place. They actually put some laws in place around that. And I know years ago, probably in 2009 or 10, I think it was, Alan Poller, before he passed, who was, of course, the founder of the SANS Institute, and also one of the early contributors to the Center for Net Security, he wanted to make sure that we were reflecting all of these safeguards clearly in the CIS controls, because he really believed in the research that they had put out and some of the good information they were providing. And again, even to this day, they've done a little bit now where they've expanded the standards. So again, in modern times, it used to be just sort of a one short list. Originally, it was 35 things, then 4 things, now 8 things. but they've gone into 3 different levels of that, the Essential 8, and there's a lot more detail sort of engaged in that now. So again, if you've not seen that, again, it's a free standard any of us can look at. It doesn't score well, but again, I wanted you to be able to see that sometimes these cyber hygiene standards don't actually score well on the model. And when we're going to put out some white papers on this eventually too, and get into some details of this, I think, just to make it more formal. But we're going to basically say either you're going to be in that initial camp of a hygiene standard, and we're going to grade hygiene standards differently. But if you're going to be a hygiene standard, you get one kind of grade, versus if you're going to be a more comprehensive standard, we're going to give you a different way of looking at those. So if I give a little bit of summary of some of the things that we found here, some standards that are on the rise, definitely the CSF. Believe it or not, ISO 20002. I think ISO and AICPA, I think in response mostly to third-party assessments. I think more and more organizations are looking at certifications because they want to be able to say, look, we're doing good things. Look at our certifications. Can you please not send us any more questionnaires? And so I think you're seeing a rise in both 27002 and the AICPA's TSC. Even though the TSC is getting a little older, it's still something that people are talking about for SOC 2 Type 2s, and it's getting a lot of attention right now. Other standards, I'd say maybe the opposite, that are maybe fading a little bit. Homeland Security's continuous diagnostics and mitigations. As much as I love the idea behind that project, you're not hearing as much conversation about it recently. Same with 853. I mean, if nothing else, I mean, that's sort of the grandfather of all these standards. I mean, it's been around longer than most any of these. And there's still lots of organizations I run into that are, for lack of a better word, saluting 853. I think the work that Dr. Ross and everyone on that team has done there is incredible. They've got a lot of really good work there. But I also know on the flip side, a lot of people feel overwhelmed by 853. And the results with all the different competing standards that are out there, it sort of makes for a hard sell for a lot of organizations when you compare NIST, 853 to 171 to the CSF, to the TSA guidelines, to C2M2, and there's so many of these different standards that are out there by federal agencies that it's getting kind of hard to prioritize one or another. I mean, certainly 53 has been around forever. Lots of federal agencies, state agencies are still looking at this. But I see very, very few people on the private sector side going after this anymore. Most of the folks are looking at the shorter, the more condensed versions, just for ease of implementation, to be honest. HIPAA, that's a whole conversation by itself. Obviously that's been fading here a bit. One might argue that some of the high-tech standards, high trust standards that came out after HIPAA and high-tech came out, are sort of making a bigger impact in healthcare now. But again, it's still out there, still law, but again, you don't see a lot of people really focused on that these days. Even sadly, COVID, I think that's just because of the specific nature of it there on the governance side. It seems like, again, it's not gotten quite the attention that it used to. Other ones that show up in the news a lot right now, of course, the SEC's 2023 disclosure rules. That's gotten a lot of attention here in recent years, especially the last maybe 12 months. The new updated amendment to the NYDFS and NYCRR 500 standard, that amendment has gotten a lot of people's attention. It sort of came out about the same time there as new SEC rules. So I think, again, this is all within the last 12 months, something to think about. I also put the FFIEC's CAT tool there, not because it's getting a lot of attention, but because FFIEC announced that they would be no longer supporting the cybersecurity assessment tool in the near future. So over the last month or two, there's been a little bit of conversation here about FFIEC's CAT and where that's going to be going next. So certainly that's up for discussion. It's something to watch the news for sure. But as you can imagine, that's also hitting the news cycles a bit there because of some of the changes for banking and financial services that tool has made. So if you look at some of the end results, I try not to focus on these, but you can see some of the grades that came out. And so if we look at sort of overall and look at some of these comprehensive standards that everyone's really focused on for the time being, you can see some of the grades that are in place. Does this mean we shouldn't be using one standard or another? No. But what you need to be aware of is that they're different. And that's the thing, if anything else you take away from this presentation today, I would say is take away the fact that a lot of these standards, none of these are good, none of these are bad, right? They're not evil. You're not going to necessarily be fired because you've chosen one of these. But the thing I want you to be aware of is that depending on what your goals are, depending on what the safeguard choices are that you need to make, you may need to look at one set of standards or another. Like I said, if you're looking more technically, maybe something like the CIS controls or 800-171 might be more in line with what you need. If you're looking for more governance oriented, maybe we're looking at something like the CSF. If we're looking for something a little more app dev focused, maybe ISO or CIS controls. But each of these is going to have a little different focus. And I guess the big thing I would tell you is, even though we have these aggregate ratings, a lot of people, I think, are viewing these standards as equals, and they're viewing these standards as comprehensively addressing all of their cybersecurity concerns. And the thing I want people to be aware of is that these are not created the same, and they don't all necessarily give you all the safeguards that you're going to want to put into place in order to achieve your goals. One of the responses I think that would probably be natural coming out of this is one of the popular approaches that's been starting maybe the last 2 or 3 years is for organizations to consider some of the aggregate cybersecurity frameworks. And you've probably seen some of these. I gave you the example of Cybersecurity Risk Foundation, the CRF safeguards, the Unified Compliance Framework, the Secure Controls Framework, High Trust, right? Where what these are doing is they're looking at all of these standards that are out there in the world and trying to address those by aggregating and giving you a bigger picture, maybe a fuller scope of some of the safeguards that might be out there. If you do want to use some of these that are out there, if you're looking to do assessment work, one of the things that we're trying to do is we're going to try to keep giving away a lot of our assessment tools and a lot of our methodologies and tools for some of this. One of the things that SANS is great about, and this is part of why I love just presenting here with SANS on research like this, is because they've been really good about just getting the information out to the public and to the community. So what SANS will do eventually is they'll make versions of this presentation available to the people who registered. They'll also make a YouTube video of this so people can watch the presentation later, and you can go ahead and watch some of watch it, slow it down, maybe look at the scores a little bit differently. And I know we've also gone through and we've released a number of tools here. And as many of you know, we've been doing this for quite a few years to try to make it easier for some of you to take these standards and either map them against other standards or use them as a part of your risk assessment processes. And that was sort of the necessity of what led to a lot of this research was most of what I do in my day job is doing risk assessment work. And so I wanted to be able to find ways of accurately looking at an organization in light of a full scope. And so one of the things that we give away are these Excel tools that help organizations in measurements and then give people these maturity rankings and 5-point scales and those kinds of things. And so a lot of that new research we're putting out is over at the Cybersecurity Risk Foundation. So if you go to crfsecure.org, you'll see a lot of that data that's there, a lot of free white papers and Excel tools and all that kind of stuff for you to download if you want to do a little bit more. So again, a couple quick calls for action. If you haven't done some of these things already, have you determined as an organization what your target's going to be? Do you have a charter in place? Has a charter defined what your business objectives are? And specifically what safeguard libraries you need to have in consideration as a part of your approach for actually defending and achieving those goals. So if you were putting a plan in place, have you as an organization made a conscious decision that says, we believe these safeguard libraries are the ones we need to pursue, either because it's law, because by contract we've agreed to it, maybe we just think it's the right thing to do. But have you agreed as an organization, right, from the executive team down, that this is a target state you're going to go after? And if you haven't, that's the number one takeaway to have you think about. Realize that these standard libraries aren't created equal, and you may go after a few of these different documents as a part of that target state, but make the determination what that target state is so you can work against it. A couple other resources. Again, I gave you the CRF link already if you want to check that out. A lot of good free stuff there, hopefully. We've also, for those of you who just want to learn more about this, I mean, certainly in an hour, I just don't have time to go through sort of a whole history of risk assessment and risk management. But one of the things I've had the privilege of being a part of the last couple of years is SANS has helped put out a couple courses on this. We wrote a brand new 2-day course, LDR 419. We also wrote a 5-day course here that we released just this year, going into a lot of these topics. And in fact, some of the things we talked about here today, we reflect some of this research in day 3 of the 519 class, because we want to sort of give people a fuller understanding of kind of what safeguard libraries are out there. The book that I've been reading lately and processing are some of the works by Nassim Taleb. If you haven't seen his work, I know everyone's read the Hubbard's books, or at least you're aware of Hubbard's books. But if you haven't seen Taleb's books, I know he's writing primarily about financial markets, but I think what he's doing as it relates to randomness and risk is worth considering. The last thing, again, I know we're going to be out of time here in just a second. I know I didn't get a lot of the questions. I apologize for the sake of time. I knew we were going to be tight today. But if I didn't get to your question, do me a favor and send me an email. You've got my email there on the screen. That's the last resource I'll give you there today. More than happy to answer questions that come up or clarify anything that comes up here today. Again, you can see my email there on the screen. But I appreciate you guys attending today. Like I said, we've been trying to give as many of these webcasts as we can throughout the year. We're excited about this webcast, especially this year, just because we have the ability to maybe make this a little more objective process. We expect in future years to continue to do this and try to give you more resources to help you make better decisions about what are the safeguard libraries you want to implement in order to help your organization achieve its goals. Again, thanks for being here on the webcast at SANS today, and hopefully look forward to having you on future podcasts.
Thank you so much, James, for your presentation and for helping to bring content like this to the SANS community. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us today. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. You can find your CPEs for all completed webcasts by logging into your SANS portal account, navigating to your account dashboard, then clicking My Webcasts. You can then download your CPE on the right-hand side of the webpage. Until next time, take care, and we hope to see you again soon.